The billionaire's dog dug a hole in the garden. What it revealed ruined the wedding. The dog found it on a Tuesday. Not that the day matters, really, but Emily Carter would remember it that way. Tuesday, around 4 in the afternoon. The light coming through the pines at that low angle that made everything look soft and expensive. The kind of light that belonged on a magazine cover. The kind of light that lied. She was standing at the kitchen window with a glass of water she hadn't touched, watching Daniel walk across the lawn with his phone pressed to his ear. He wasn't talking anymore, just scrolling, half present, the way he got after a long call. Atlas trotted beside him, the big German shepherd they'd had for 3 years now, the one Daniel trusted more than most people. Emily liked Atlas, she did, but some part of her had always watched that dog with something she couldn't quite name. Not fear, more like a low hum of awareness. The way you feel around someone who knows too much. Daniel stopped near the old oak. He leaned against it, still looking at his phone. Atlas wandered off into the far corner of the garden, the corner with the loose soil, the corner near the stone wall where the ivy came over from next door. Emily set her glass down. She told herself it was nothing. Dogs dig. That's what they do. She'd seen Atlas dig up a tennis ball once, a garden glove another time. It was always nothing. But her feet were already moving before she made any decision to move them. She pushed through the back door and stepped onto the grass. The air smelled like pine and cut wood, cold even for September. Daniel looked up and gave her that easy smile, the one that still did something to her chest after 6 years. She smiled back, kept walking toward him like she was just coming to say hello. Atlas had his nose in the dirt now. His back legs were kicking behind him in short, urgent bursts. "Hey!" Daniel held out his arm, and she stepped into it. He kissed the side of her head. "Good timing. I was just about to come in. What's he found?" she asked, and her voice came out steady. She was proud of that. Daniel squinted at the dog. No idea. Probably a bone he buried last summer. He laughed a little. "He's been circling that spot for a week." Emily laughed, too. The sound of it felt hollow inside her chest, because she knew what was in that corner. She had put it there herself. 3 years ago, on a cold October morning, when she'd just moved in and the house still felt like someone else's dream, she hadn't been thinking clearly. She'd just wanted it gone, all of it, buried, out of reach, out of sight. Atlas pulled something from the ground. A corner of dirty envelope appeared between his teeth. Daniel didn't notice yet. He was checking his phone again. Emily stopped breathing. Daniel saw it a second later. Atlas had dropped the envelope on the grass and was sniffing around it, tail moving slow, the way he did when he'd found something he wasn't sure about. The thing was dirty, dark with soil, edges soft from years underground. It looked like it had been there a long time. Daniel crouched down. "What is that?" He wasn't really asking her, just thinking out loud. The way he did, Emily's mouth was dry. She watched him pick it up, watched his fingers brush the dirt off the front. The envelope was sealed still, barely, the flap gone soft. Her name was on it, or it had been, once. The ink had bled into the paper until the letters were more shadow than word. M. He turned it over. "This has your name on it, does it?" She heard herself say it. .com, almost bored, like she was looking at someone else's mail. He handed it to her. The paper felt heavier than it should have. She knew exactly what was inside without opening it. 3 letters, maybe 4, all from the same collections agency. Final notice. The words she'd read so many times, they'd stopped meaning anything. A number she'd spent years pretending didn't exist. $41,000. Student loans she'd taken out at 22 for a design program she'd finished but never fully paid for. The kind of debt that starts manageable and then, quietly, while you're busy trying to survive, becomes something else. She'd made payments when she could, stopped when she couldn't, ignored the letters until ignoring them felt like the only sane option. Then she'd met Daniel, and the life she'd been building in her head, the clean version, the one without the debt and the collection calls and the shame, suddenly felt possible, real, so close she could touch it. She buried the envelope 6 weeks after moving into his house, 8 months after their first date. 2 months before he proposed, she had told herself it was temporary, that she'd deal with it later, that it wasn't lying exactly, it was just waiting for the right moment. The right moment never came. "You okay?" Daniel was watching her. "Yeah." She turned the envelope over in her hands. "It's old. Probably junk mail that got into the garden somehow." He looked at her. Just for a beat, one of those looks he had, where you couldn't tell if he believed you or was deciding whether to push. Then he nodded. looked back at Atlas. "Smart dog," he said. "Finding things." Emily smiled. Inside her chest, something pulled tight and didn't let go. She went inside before he did. Made an excuse about starting dinner, something easy, something that gave her hands a reason to move. She put the envelope on the kitchen counter and stood there looking at it while the water for pasta came slowly to a boil. The rational part of her brain ran the numbers. The debt was old. Collections agencies had a statute of limitation. The amount had probably stopped growing years ago. In the grand scheme of Daniel Whitmore's net worth, a number she'd seen quoted in a Forbes profile once, a number with 9 digits, $41,000, was nothing. It was less than nothing. It was the cost of a decent watch. That wasn't the point, and she knew it. She picked up the envelope and opened it. 4 letters, she'd been right. The first 3 were from a collections agency she didn't recognize anymore. They got bought and sold. These agencies passed around like bad debt always was. The 4th was different. It was from a law firm, dated 6 years ago. It said that if payment arrangements were not made within 30 days, they would pursue legal remedies. Legal remedies. She remembered reading that phrase for the first time on her apartment floor in Denver, 28 years old, eating cereal for dinner because she'd miscalculated her rent. She remembered thinking she should call someone, her mother, maybe, a lawyer, anyone. She'd called no one. She'd folded the letter back into the envelope and put it in a box with the others, and eventually, when the box felt like too much to carry, she'd driven it to Daniel's house and walked it to the far corner of the garden on a morning when he was traveling and pushed it 2 feet into the earth with her bare hands. She'd washed her hands 3 times afterward. She remembered that too. The pasta water boiled. She heard the back door open, Atlas's nails on the hardwood, then Daniel's footsteps, unhurried, easy. The walk of someone who had never once in his life felt the specific dread of checking his bank balance. She put the letters back in the envelope. She put the envelope in the drawer next to the stove, the one where they kept takeout menus and expired coupons and things they meant to deal with later. "Smells good," Daniel said, coming into the kitchen. "It's just pasta still." He came up behind her and kissed the back of her neck. She felt his hand rest on her shoulder, warm and easy. "Long day." "Yeah," she said. He didn't ask what was wrong. He never pushed. That was one of the things she'd loved about him. Early on, he gave people room. He trusted them to come to him when they were ready. She had mistaken that for safety. Now, she wasn't sure what it was. She didn't sleep. Not really. She lay there in the dark, listening to Daniel breathe beside her, slow and even, the sleep of someone with a clear conscience, and she stared at the ceiling and thought about the drawer next to the stove. At some point, she got up. 2 in the morning, maybe later. The house was cold the way mountain houses always got at night, the kind of cold that came up through the floors. She padded downstairs in bare feet and stood in the kitchen without turning on the lights. She opened the drawer. The envelope was still there. Of course it was. She didn't know what she'd expected, that it would dissolve. Maybe that the night would take it. She sat down at the kitchen table and spread the letters out in front of her in the thin light coming through the window for pieces of paper. That's all they were. She'd given them so much power for so long that she'd forgotten they were just paper. The thing about shame is that it doesn't stay where you put it. You bury it and it moves. It gets into everything. The way you hold yourself at a dinner party, the way you change the subject when someone mentions student loans, the small flinch when Daniel's accountant calls the house. She'd built an entire architecture around this secret, careful, load-bearing walls. Touch one, and the whole thing shifted. She thought about the woman she'd been at 22. Bright, broke, convinced that if she worked hard enough, the money stuff would eventually sort itself out. It hadn't. It had compounded, and somewhere along the way, the debt had stopped being a financial problem and become a story she told herself about who she was. Someone who couldn't manage things, someone who didn't deserve the life she had now. That was the part she'd never told Daniel. Not the number, the story. She heard him before she saw him. A creak on the stairs, then his silhouette in the doorway. He stood there for a moment, looking at her, and then at the letters spread out on the table. He didn't say anything right away. He walked to the cabinet and got 2 glasses and filled them with water from the tap and set one in front of her. Then he sat down across from her. Not next to her, across. And he looked at the letters the way he looked at problems in meetings, steady, neutral, already thinking. "How long?" he said. Just that, 2 words. Emily looked at her hands flat on the table. "Since before we met." He nodded once, picked up the closest letter, read it, set it down, read the next one. She watched his face and felt something she hadn't expected. Not relief, not terror, but something closer to grief, like she was watching something end. "Daniel, give me a minute," he said quietly. So she did. The minute stretched into 10. Daniel read each letter twice, set them in a neat stack when he was done, edges aligned, the way he organized everything. Then he sat back in his chair and looked at the window. Outside, the pines were just visible in the dark black shapes against a slightly less black sky. Emily waited. She had rehearsed this conversation 100 times in her head, different versions, different outcomes. In some of them, he was angry. In some, he was quiet and cold in a way that was worse than angry. In a few of the better ones, he laughed, pulled her close, told her she was ridiculous for carrying this alone. He wasn't doing any of those things. He was just sitting there. And she realized she didn't actually know him well enough to read his silence. 6 years. And this was the first time she'd seen this particular version of him, the one with nothing to say. "The debt itself," he finally said, "that's nothing. You know that I know. $41,000 is, I know what it is, Daniel." He looked at her then, really looked. Then why? Such a simple question. She'd asked herself the same thing 1,000 times, usually at 3 in the morning, usually in the same kitchen where they were sitting right now. Why hadn't she just told him? Early on, when it would have been easy? Before the ring? Before the house? Before the life they'd built together became something so solid that the thought of cracking it felt unsurvivable. "I was embarrassed," she said. "Of what?" "Of having student loans. Emily, half the country not of the loans." She stopped, started again. "Of the fact that I'd let it get that bad, that I'd ignored it for that long. That I was the kind of person who buried things in the garden instead of dealing with them." Something moved across his face. Not softness exactly. Recognition maybe? "I didn't want you to see that version of me," she said. "Before I had things together, before I was," she gestured vaguely at the kitchen, the house, all of it. This, he repeated. "I didn't think you'd want me if you knew." The silence that followed was different from the one before, heavier. She watched him process it, the real thing she'd said, underneath the words about money and debt and shame. The actual confession. He stood up. She thought for a moment he was leaving the room. Instead, he went to the counter and stood there with his back to her, one hand flat on the marble. "I'd built 3 companies," he said. "The first one failed so badly I couldn't make rent for 4 months. I ate peanut butter sandwiches for 6 weeks. I have never told anyone that." Emily didn't move. Not because I was ashamed of the struggle. He turned around because by the time anyone was paying attention, it didn't fit the story anymore. He looked at her across the kitchen. "I understand more than you think," he said. "That's what makes this hard." He slept in the guest room that night. He didn't announce it, didn't make it dramatic. Around 3:30 he picked up his water glass, said he was going to try to get a few hours, and walked down the hall. The door didn't slam. That would have been easier. In a way, it just clicked shut, quiet and final. The sound of a man who was too controlled to make a scene. Emily sat at the kitchen table until the sky started to lighten. She thought about what he'd said. "I understand more than you think. That's what makes this hard." She'd turned those 2 sentences over so many times, in the dark they'd started to lose their shape. Was that forgiveness building up to something? Was it the beginning of the end, dressed in careful language? With Daniel, you never knew right away. He processed things alone, brought them back fully formed. It was efficient. It was also, she realized now, a little terrifying. She made coffee when the light came, stood at the window and watched the garden. Atlas was already out there moving along the tree line, nose down. She watched him loop around the old oak, past the stone wall, toward the corner where he'd dug yesterday. He sniffed the spot, circled it once, then sat down and looked back at the house, directly at her, the way dogs sometimes did, like they understood more than they were letting on. "Yeah," she said quietly. "Me too." She heard Daniel's alarm go off upstairs at 6, the shower running, the specific sounds of a man getting ready for a day he intended to get through, regardless of what the night had been. She poured a second cup of coffee and left it on the counter near the machine where he always picked his up. When he came downstairs, he was dressed, a jacket on. The version of him the rest of the world saw, composed, unreachable. The face that had been on the covers of 3 magazines. He saw the coffee, picked it up. "I have calls until noon," he said. "Okay, We should talk tonight. Okay, he looked at her then. Not the magazine face. Something underneath it. Something she didn't have a name for. I'm not going anywhere, Emily. I just need to think. She nodded, felt her throat tightened. The debt is not the issue, he said. One more time. Like he needed her to actually hear it. I need you to understand that. I do. I don't think you do yet. He set the cup down. But you will. He picked up his keys from the hook by the door. Atlas came in from the garden and sat at his feet, and he reached down and scratched the dog's ears without looking. Automatic, the gesture of a man who always knew where his dog was. Then he left. Emily stood in the kitchen for a long time after the car pulled out of the driveway. The coffee she'd made for herself had gone cold. She hadn't noticed she called her sister at 9. Mara was 3 years younger and lived in Phoenix and had always been the one Emily called when she needed someone who wouldn't try to fix things. Just listen. Mara was good at that. He slept in the guest room, Emily said. A pause. But he's still there. He went to work. Okay, another pause. Shorter. That's not nothing, Em. Emily was sitting on the back porch steps with her knees pulled up, the way she used to sit as a kid on the front stoop of their mother's house in Ohio. The morning was cold and bright. Atlas was somewhere in the garden, invisible behind the hedges, doing his rounds. I keep thinking about why I didn't tell him, she said. And I keep landing on the same answer, and I hate it. What's the answer? That I didn't trust him enough. Mara was quiet for a moment. Or you didn't trust yourself enough. To be loved as the full version? Emily didn't say anything. You spent so long curating the version he got to see, Mara said. The together version. The successful one. And at some point, that version became the marriage. So, telling him the truth wasn't just embarrassing, it felt like it would erase you. When did you get so smart? I've been in therapy for 4 years. I'm basically a professional at this point. Emily almost laughed. Almost. Is he angry? Mara asked. That's the thing I don't know. He said the debt isn't the issue. He said he understood. But then he went to bed in the other room, and this morning she searched for the word distant, not cold, just far away. That sounds like someone who's hurt. I know, hurt is actually better than angry, Mara said. Angry people want to win. Hurt people want to be seen. Emily looked out at the garden. The pines were perfectly still. The sky above them was the hard blue you only got at altitude, clean and a little brutal. She thought about the corner where Atlas had dug, the dark soil, the envelope, the way it had felt in her hands. Heavier than paper had any right to feel. I buried it, she said, literally. I put it in the ground. I know, you told me. No, I mean, she stopped. I think I actually believed that would work. That I could just put it in the ground and it would stop being real. Mara didn't respond right away. When she did, her voice was careful. You know that's not about the debt. I know that's about everything. You decided you had to hide to deserve a good life. The words landed somewhere deep. Emily pressed her hand flat against the cold stone of the step and felt the solidity of it, real, unmoving, indifferent. I have to fix this, she said. Yes, Mara said. You do. I don't know if I can. You can. But, Emily, a beat. You have to fix the right thing, not just the marriage. The thing underneath it. Atlas appeared from behind the hedges and trotted toward her across the lawn. He put his head in her lap without being invited. His ears were cold from the morning air. She sat there with her hand on the dog's head and felt, for the first time in a long time, the specific weight of something that was finally above ground. He came home at 7. She heard the car in the driveway, the door, his keys on the hook, the same sounds as every other night. She was in the kitchen again. She'd spent most of the day in the kitchen, as if proximity to the scene of the thing would help her understand it. She'd made dinner, actually made it this time, not just pasta, something that required attention. A chicken she'd had to season and time and check on. She needed her hands busy. She needed a reason to keep moving. Daniel came in, set his jacket over the chair, looked at the stove. Smells good, he said. Same words as the night before. She almost said it's just chicken, the way she'd said it's just pasta, caught herself, said nothing. They ate at the table. Not the kitchen island where they usually ate on weeknights, the actual dining table, the one they used for guests. She wasn't sure which of them had set it there without discussing it. It felt like neutral ground. A conference table? He asked about her day. She asked about his. They talked about a project she had in Basalt, a client who kept changing his mind about the kitchen tile. Daniel listened the way he always did, fully, asking the right questions. For 20 minutes, it was almost normal. Then, he set his fork down. "I've been thinking about what you said," he started, "that you didn't think I'd want you if I knew." Emily put her own fork down. "I've been trying to figure out if I did something to make you feel that way," he said. "If there was something in how I talked about money, or about the past, that made you think you had to be perfect to be here." She opened her mouth. He held up one hand, not stopping her, just asking for a moment. "And I think the honest answer is maybe yes. Maybe I made this life feel like something you had to earn? Like there were conditions?" He looked at the table. "I don't say that as an excuse for you. I say it because I think we both built something that didn't have enough room in it for real things." The candle between them, she'd lit it without thinking. Some automatic instinct toward softness threw light across his face in a way that made him look older, or maybe just more honest. "I'm not leaving," he said. "I want to be clear about that. Okay, but I need something from you that I don't know how to ask for exactly." He paused. "I need to know that you'll tell me things. Not everything, not every fear or doubt or embarrassing thing from your past, just the things that matter. The things you're carrying alone." Emily felt something loosen in her chest, something that had been wound tight for so long she'd forgotten it was there. "I should have told you," she said. "I know that I knew it then. Why didn't you?" She'd answered this last night. But last night it had been the surface answer. Embarrassment, shame, the curated version of herself. "Tonight she went deeper, because you were the first thing in my life that felt safe," she said. "And I was terrified of losing it, so I protected it, even from the truth." Daniel was quiet for a long moment. "That's the most honest thing you've ever said to me," he finally said. "I know. That's also the problem." She held his gaze one day. He said, "I want us to have more than one night like this." Outside, somewhere in the dark garden, Atlas barked once at something in the trees, then went quiet. 3 weeks later, Emily paid off the debt, not Daniel her. She'd called the collections agency on a Thursday morning, while Daniel was on a call. Upstairs, and Atlas was asleep in a patch of sun on the kitchen floor. She'd used money from her own account, savings she'd been building slowly for years, client payments she'd been careful with, money that was hers before any of this. It took 47 minutes on the phone, a lot of hold music. A representative named Greg, who read her account number back to her 3 times, and kept calling her ma'am. When it was done, she sat very still for a moment. Then she took the 4 letters out of the drawer next to the stove, and stood over the kitchen sink and burned them, one at a time, with a long match from the box they kept for the fireplace. She watched each one catch and curl and go black at the edges. The smoke was thin and white and smelled like old paper. Atlas opened one eye, closed it again. She told Daniel that evening, not because she needed credit for it, she'd thought carefully about that. Talked it through with Mara, decided the point wasn't the gesture, but the telling. The point was no more drawers, no more corners of the garden. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he nodded slowly, the way he did when he was taking something in. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Lighter," she said. And then, because it was true and she was trying to be better at true things, and a little angry at myself for waiting so long, "Good," he said. "Hold on to the lighter. Let go of the rest." Easy for him to say. But she was learning that Daniel's straightforward advice was usually right, even when it annoyed her. They were in therapy by then, not crisis therapy, not the kind where someone was walking out the door. The other kind, the kind where 2 people who basically loved each other sat in a room with a third person and tried to figure out how they'd built a house with a locked room in it. Their therapist was a woman named Dr. Okafor who had a plant on her windowsill that Emily always looked at when she needed a moment to collect herself. It was some kind of succulent, resilient looking. She appreciated that. In their 3rd session, Daniel had said something Emily hadn't expected. He'd said that finding the envelope had scared him, not because of what was in it, but because he'd realized, standing in that garden, that the person he thought he knew completely was someone he'd never fully asked about. "I just assumed," he'd said. "I assumed, because things looked good, that they were good." Dr. Okafor had let that sit in the room for a long time. Now, 3 weeks out, the guest room door had been open for 2 weeks. Atlas had stopped circling the corner of the garden, as if whatever energy had been buried there had finally gone. Emily stood at the kitchen window one evening and watched Daniel throw a ball for the dog across the darkening lawn. His breath making small clouds in the cold air, And she thought about the woman who had pushed that envelope into the ground 3 years ago, scared, ashamed, convinced that love was conditional on perfection. She felt sorry for her. And grateful, in a strange way, that a dog had lousy impulse control around interesting smells. Spring came late that year. It always did at that altitude. You'd think winter was done, and then March would come back cold and mean for another 3 weeks, just to remind you who was in charge. But by April, the ground had softened, and the pines had that new growth smell, and the garden behind the house looked like it was deciding, slowly, to try again. Emily was outside with a trowel when she found it. Not another envelope, just a rock, smooth, flat, the kind that had no business being 2 feet underground. She turned it over in her hand and set it on the stone wall and kept digging. She was putting in something her mother had always grown, a stubborn perennial that came back every year, regardless of what the winter had done to it. She'd chosen the corner deliberately. Atlas watched from the porch with his chin on his paws, tracking her the way he did, that steady shepherd attention that never fully turned off. She'd stopped feeling watched by him. Now, it felt more like company. Daniel came out around noon with 2 cups of coffee and sat on the back steps. He didn't ask what she was planting. He'd learned over these months that she liked to do some things without narrating them first. She'd learned that he needed more words than she'd been giving him. They were both adjusting. It was slower than either of them would have liked and more necessary than either of them had understood. She pressed the first plant into the ground with both hands. The soil was cold and dark and real. Dr. Okafor asked me something this week, Emily said without looking up. She asked what I was most afraid of now, not before now. What did you say? I said I was afraid of forgetting what this felt like. She sat back on her heels. The discomfort, the openness, I'm afraid that in a year or two everything will smooth over and I'll go back to curating instead of living. Daniel was quiet for a moment. That's a reasonable thing to be afraid of, I know, so don't forget it. She looked at him over her shoulder. He was holding both cups, one extended toward her. His expression, straightforward in the way she'd come to understand, wasn't coldness, but clarity. He meant it simply. Don't forget, it wasn't complicated. She took the coffee. I keep thinking about what Atlas was actually doing, she said. That day, I've decided he wasn't trying to expose me. He was just following something he could smell that nobody else could. He didn't know what it meant. He's a dog, right? He's a dog. She turned back to the garden. He didn't rescue us. He just dug a hole, and then we did the rest. Yeah. She pressed the second plant in beside the first. We did the rest. She worked for another hour while Daniel went back inside. The sun moved across the garden the way it always did, unhurried, indifferent, lighting everything equally. The new plants looked small and a little uncertain in the dark soil. They'd come back. That's what they did. Atlas got up from the porch eventually and wandered over and sniffed the freshly turned earth with great seriousness, the way he approached all investigations. Then he sneezed, shook his head, and went to find a sunnier spot on the lawn. Emily laughed. It came out easy. Unplanned. The realest sound she'd made in months. Nobody talks about the dog. That's the thing Emily notices months later, when she tries to explain what happened to people she trusts enough to tell. She'll be getting to the part about Atlas digging in the corner, and she'll watch their faces shift, a small smile. The kind people make when something is both terrible and a little bit funny. And then the conversation always moves on to the marriage, the letters, the night at the kitchen table. Atlas is just the setup, the inciting incident, the comic relief. But she thinks about him differently. She thinks about the way he'd been circling that corner for a week before he dug, patient, persistent, returning to the same spot every day, the way he returned to his water bowl or his place on the rug, not because anyone told him to, but because something in him said, this matters, keep going, there's something here. He wasn't trying to save her. He was just being honest about what he could smell. She's tried to apply that to herself since then. Not the digging, she's done enough of that, literal and otherwise, but the returning, the willingness to keep circling something uncomfortable instead of walking away from it. To say to herself, quietly, without drama, there's something here, don't leave yet. It's harder than it sounds. Some mornings, she still catches herself curating, choosing the version of a story that ends cleanest, smoothing the edges before Daniel hears it. Old habits, she catches it faster now, which is something she doesn't always correct it in time, which is also something the less flattering kind. Dr. Okafor calls it a practice, not a fix, a practice. Emily has started to prefer that word. Fix implies you were broken. Practice implies you're just a person, doing the thing again. Getting a little better or a little worse depending on the day, showing up anyway. The corner of the garden is full now. The perennials came in strong, stronger than she'd expected for a first season. She'd worried the soil was too compacted, too cold from years of Colorado winters, but they pushed through regardless, the way that particular plant always did, indifferent to what had been buried there before. Daniel photographed them one morning without telling her. She found the picture later on his phone, the corner of the garden in early light, the plants just visible above the soil, the stone wall in the background. He'd made it his lock screen. She didn't say anything about it. She didn't have to. Atlas is 7 now. He moves a little slower in the mornings, takes the stairs with more consideration than he used to. He still does his rounds in the garden every day, still investigates everything with that absolute seriousness, still finds things nobody else was looking for. She trusts him completely. That's the part she couldn't have predicted, that the animal who appended her life would become the one she felt safest around. No performance required. No curated version accepted. Just the truth of whatever you were carrying, plain as a smell on the wind. He always knows she's decided. That's not something to fear.